Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Decoupled Architecture in WordPress. Your speaker for today is Josh Koenig, co-founder and head of developer experience here at Pantheon. Just a few housekeeping items to go over before we start. Please make sure you submit any questions you have during the presentation in the question window or tweet them at GetPantheon. We'll answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. Anything we don't answer, you can always email us and ask. Also, this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be made available to everyone in the next few days. Now I'd like to turn it over to Josh.
Thanks, Atusa. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the webcam for now and fire up my slides. We'll maybe put that back on during Q&A because it's more fun. So here we go. We're going to talk about, let me see if I can fix this problem real quick. There we go. We are going to talk about content as a service, decoupled WordPress with the REST API. As Atusa mentioned, my name is Josh. I'm co-founder and head of product here at Pantheon. I'm outlandish Josh almost any place on the internet. And of course, Pantheon, as you know, is a website management platform, and I'm so glad you were all able to join me here today. So this is a timely topic, especially in the WordPress space. We were recently at WordCamp US in Philadelphia, the first national level WordCamp event in North America. And at the State of the Word keynote presentation, Mr. Mullenweg said, and I quote, "JavaScript is the future of the web. I know this as surely as I know that barbecue is delicious." I'm trying to mimic his delight at how delicious barbecue is, because he's very enthusiastic about this stuff. But this was a major theme as part of the State of the Word and at the conference in general. Matt challenged the WordPress developer community to, quote, "learn JavaScript deeply." And I think in particular he's excited about the future of WordPress as an API platform, as a piece of the Internet of Things story, and as a and with the ability to power new use cases and deliver very, very modern and novel functionality that goes well beyond simple blogging or even lightweight CMS. There's a bunch of other announcements. We'll get to some of the things that are actually happening at the end, but this is a big deal. I would say within the world of modern JavaScript, there are a lot of frameworks out there, and of course there are a number of things that aren't quite what we would call a modern framework, like jQuery, which I think is still a part of almost everyone's toolkit for manipulating the DOM and the browser. But within the WordPress space, I'd say that it looks like there are three winners that are emerging from the scrum of JavaScript frameworks that are part of the decoupling story. Certainly Matt and Automatic seem to be bullish on React.js. They used that for their application Calypso, and he sort of all but said this is the one that we want in the keynote. React is one of the newest. It's backed by Facebook. It has a lot of wonderful features in it, a lot of good thinking. Backbone.js is another one that is doing quite well. It's actually already included in the WordPress admin area. It's also included in Drupal 8. So this is a toolkit that a lot of developers are using for building more featureful next-generation administrative experiences, complex user interfaces, and so forth. It's a little bit lower level than the others. It doesn't do as much for you, but it is quite a useful tool. And of course, Angular, which is the JavaScript framework that Google is supporting. So you have like frameworks being supported by Google and Facebook, and there's a reason why those have a lot of momentum behind them, because with that institutional support, there's a better chance of them still being around in 5 to 10 years. There are going to be other frameworks that will emerge. There are still some pretty unsolved fundamental problems in the world of JavaScript frameworks in terms of data persistence and immutability and a lot of advanced topics that a lot of JavaScript developers are eagerly working on pretty much every day. But if you wanted to pick up a new framework today, I would strongly recommend choosing one of these three, since they seem to be quite widely adopted within the WordPress space. And this is what gets us into this topic of decoupling. Decoupling doesn't necessarily, does not mean that you're going to use a JavaScript framework. Decoupling can actually mean it covers a broader set of use cases, as we'll see later on in the presentation. But if you want to be on this kind of new school JavaScript framework train, you're going to need to learn about how to decouple your CMS, because all of these advanced framework clients, they act as a client to a server, and they expect to speak over a REST API, and almost all of them would default to speaking JSON. And what do you know, wonder of wonders, that's what's now in WordPress core as of release 4.4. So it's again, very timely subject to be talking about. Still a lot of innovation happening, still a lot of work to be done, but very happy to see you all here today. So I like to position the concept of decoupled CMS within a broader conversation that's happening on the internet in general about the virtue of monoliths versus microservices from an architectural standpoint. This isn't just for websites, this is for most applications. This debate is raging. And it's not really that there's a right or wrong. There are really good reasons to develop monolithic pieces of software, and even monolithic pieces of software obviously fit within a larger ecosystem of connected systems. So, you know, when you're building something really complicated, it's got a lot of ins and outs. A lot of times the only way to get it done in an efficient manner and make it reliable is to build it as a single thing. Like the Linux kernel is a monolithic kernel for that reason. It was the one that got done. The GNU project was trying to do a sort of a decoupled kernel, and it's still not quite ready for prime time. So nothing wrong with monoliths. In the world of the web, our CMSs are historically quite monolithic. WordPress is a monolith, Drupal is a monolith. These are single applications that contain the templates and themes, the display logic, the business logic, the editorial user interface, the administrative user interface. All these functions are contained inside a single application. And the challenge with monoliths is that when it comes to implementing these things, especially if you're customizing or tooling the application for a specific site, things get jumbled up. Right? It's very easy for nobody ever would put a SQL query in their theme. Oh no, that never happens. No, it happens all too often, and especially if you're inheriting code from someone else, the jumbling that can occur within a monolith can be quite confusing. Versus the decoupled approach, which it says we are going to actually build these functions as separate applications, and there's going to be a strong boundary between them. There's going to be an API between them, and over that API, only certain things can pass. So it becomes just that much more difficult, to the point of impossibility of like crossing the streams. So people will say, no, but we have a theme layer, like I just mentioned. The theme layer is an architectural choice. And if by architectural choice you mean a different directory where you put the files that are related to the theme versus plugins, that is true. But there is nothing that you can't do at the theme layer. And so while there is this kind of convention of boundary of things you should or shouldn't do there versus in plugins or let be handled by core, there's nothing preventing you from having a theme do a whole bunch of business logic and run all kinds of SQL queries. And sometimes you actually even see this where people have, they kind of build a monolithic theme that's like, just install this theme, and it turns your website into a completely finished sort of product of one type or another. That's the theme layer just taking over everything. And the challenge, again, is because this is a permeable boundary, there's nothing that prevents the theme layer from doing anything at once within the application, especially if you inherit projects from someone else or you work on a large team and you're passing things back and forth. Building the website kind of becomes a game of Twister, which, as we all know, is fun at parties, but it can be an exciting but awkward game of chance. You might end up like all twisted up with your face someplace it doesn't want to be. And this can lead to ragey developers. I've experienced this myself in my career many times over, and I'm sure many of you on the webinar have as well. The sense of like, I can't believe they put this here, shaking fists at the heavens, and then realizing there was probably a reason for that, and actually refactoring it would be really hard, and living with this decision that was made early on in the project that did cross the streams, and now you're stuck with it. And it kind of it also makes it difficult to refactor because of the twisted upness, the kind of stereotypical spaghetti code, if you will, can make it very difficult to make changes to something once it's up and running. So these are reasons why the monolithic architecture has some weaknesses, and why a lot of people are very interested in microservices and in decoupling. There are other reasons. So let's just actually get into what a strong separation of concerns means first. So you have a client, and that could be one of many things, as we'll determine, and then you have WordPress, which is providing data over an HTTP API. And now with the frameworks, the REST API going into 4.4, and there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening here. And what this means is that you get to actually have the best of both worlds operating in both places. So rather than having things be jumbled up and getting wires crossed, you have a clear sense of like, here's what's happening in the client, here's what's happening on the API. We can focus on those things separately, we can iterate on those things separately, and it's a stable and safe way to drive progress forward. It also is key to using the tools that you would prefer. Like front-end development is moving really fast and innovating very fast, and that's so exciting, right? HTML5 and the broader set of front-end tools that kind of get lumped around in HTML5, so like modern CSS properties, CSS3 and beyond, as well as EMCA 6 or JavaScript 6. These are becoming the lingua franca of applications in general. You see more and more people actually building desktop apps using these tools. Mobile apps are very frequently built using these tools. A lot of stuff like compiles these to whatever native mobile code you might want to run. Getting into a modern front-end tool chain is one of the upsides of pursuing this decoupled approach. Even if you're actually producing a static site at the end of the day and not a dynamic, like driven by a front-end framework site, you could take advantage of these new front-end tools and the front-end tool chains that utilizing things like Pattern Lab for atomic design, having build steps run through Grunt. Those are all things that are more possible when you build a website with a decoupled approach. The other thing that decoupling allows you to do is actually parallel track the progress of your project. It's kind of an organizational thing, but it's actually quite cool. So when you want to decouple, you need to agree on that API, right? And this is actually forces work up front, which can be troublesome or it can be a challenge. But in contrast to the permeable boundary of the theme layer, which lets you kind of like hand wave at a lot of things, like we'll figure it out in the theme. If you want to build a decoupled implementation, you have to actually sit down and agree on what's in that API. This is what people talk about when they say the API as a contract between the front end and the back end. And the beauty of that is, if you can agree on what's in that API, you can build a mock-up implementation. Like literally, there could just be a set of 5 or 10 flat JSON text files that you turn over to your front-end theme and say, go nuts, start building the front end, and you hand it to your back-end team to say, hey, here's what the API needs to deliver, figure it out. Now both of those teams can work in parallel since they're working to meet the same contract, and they can actually move pretty rapidly because they're unblocked by one another. And you don't get into this kind of catch-22 of like, well, we can't really build our front end until the data model is figured out on the back end, and the back end doesn't know what the data model needs to be until the front end design is implemented. And do you want to? Should we just? I thought you were gonna. People get into this kind of stuff back and forth mode sometimes with a tightly coupled implementation that can be a real challenge. So parallel tracking the progress by agreeing on an API contract is a definite benefit of the decoupled approach. And there's the notion of future proofing. So when you have a decoupled implementation, your front end or your back end are replaceable, because as long as you can replace it with something that meets the same API contract, you can actually rip it out and put on something else. Or you can actually have multiple front ends, or in theory, multiple back ends, although that's a little harder to imagine. So oftentimes, when it comes to monolithic implementations, when you build, you build the website and then you want to do a redesign, and it's not just as simple as swapping out the theme, because things are twisted up somewhere in there, and it turns out that actually the theme is highly coupled to some particularities of how some plugins were implemented and some specifics of the fields and the data model, and the new design that you want to do actually requires refactoring all of that, so the redesign ends up being a total re-implementation. And it's not as though a decoupled approach prevents that from ever happening, because you could come up with a new design that demands a new API, right? Then you're actually doing more re-implementation. But if you have the API, you can actually iterate on the design on the front end and know that you're not going to have unintended consequences. You have some confidence that because you're talking to the same API as before, you're not going to suddenly break a lot of other things by developing a new design or a new implementation on the front end. And it gives you the ability to move faster and sort of future-proof yourself a little bit. For people who are really paranoid, and sometimes like big-time corporate IT people fit this description, having the future-proof backend can also be appealing because you say, sure, we're using WordPress now because it's quick and easy to set up, and content administrators love it, and we know it really well, and we can guarantee that it'll work perfectly, and you'll have a great website. But hey, if you decide that this really, needs some more mojo, and you want to re-implement it in, custom whatever, you'll have the API spec to do that with. And the chances that that actually happens are pretty low, but it can be, for someone who's looking at mitigating risk in like the 5 to 10 year time frame, people who think that way can be, sort of soothed by the ability to replace one piece of the decoupled architecture at a time. So I've been talking about all the benefits and all the wonderful things that come along with decoupling, and I'm sure you all are just itching to get out and do it right now. And so I want to tell you not to, or at least to be cautious, right? There are a lot of caveats that go into this. This is new stuff, it's exciting stuff. That also makes it, in some ways, risky stuff. And the very first thing you need to be mindful of is that WordPress does a lot of things for you. And if you decouple the client side away from WordPress, WordPress can no longer do things for that client side. That seems obvious, but you should really think about it. When you go through the periodic table of WordPress plugins, a lot of the top plugins are display-oriented. They do things like optimize your page for SEO. That's no longer going to happen. It'll be up to your front-end developers to know what needs to be done to optimize for SEO. One thing to point out is SEO and the ability for a search crawler to understand a JavaScript rendered front end has been a kind of a scare for a lot of people for a long time, but I would like to put out there that that's pretty much FUD at this point. All of the major search engines are running JavaScript to see what the actual end user sees. They've needed to do that at a primitive level for a long time to prevent people from gaming the system with keyword hiding. But now they're like, they're really going all in on this. Like in Google Webmaster Tools, you can go in and actually see like a preview of what the crawler sees when it renders your page to be sure that it's actually working, and it'll actually do it in both like desktop and mobile versions. So all that stuff is handled. You don't need to worry about, oh, I gotta run a shadow site that has all the static content so that it can be indexed by search engines. If you're doing a proper implementation on the front end, that is no longer necessary. But whatever your JavaScript renders is what the search engine will parse, and your JavaScript or whatever your front end is needs to do smart things for SEO. It needs to have the right tags, it needs to have the right hierarchy, it needs to have the right metadata. You can no longer rely on a plugin to do that. Likewise, things like localization or translation, those are now entirely the responsibility of the front end to handle, which can be complex. It can be a real challenge to do things like that. So be aware that when you decouple, it's very powerful, but as Spider-Man always reminds us, with great power comes great responsibility. So you're taking on more responsibility when you decouple. The other thing that you're going to have to do is you're going to have to learn. In addition to learning JavaScript deeply, as Mr. Mullenweg advises, you will also need to learn HTTP. And HTTP is a thing. As a developer, I couldn't agree more with Matt's call to action to learn JavaScript. It's not going to go out of style anytime soon. It's going to be super useful. You won't regret it. You also won't regret learning a lot about HTTP. This is the underlying protocol that makes the whole web go, and knowing how it works and what is capable with it is incredibly important for a developer who wants to keep their skill set current for the next decade. Because I think a lot of us start out and we're just kind of in this mode of like, I need to get the page off the server. And the very simplest understanding of this is really based on that simple, there's a directory somewhere. The mental model is still one of, there's a directory somewhere, it's got some HTML files in it, and I'm fetching them with my browser. But actually, HTTP is a very rich protocol. It does a lot of things. Especially when you start using it actively in the sense of an API. You have various verbs, you have headers, you have status codes, you have content encodings, and then you have all the different ways in which HTTP can make or break your caching implementation. These are all really, really good things to learn a lot about. If you become an expert in these things, your skills will be valuable for many, many, many years to come. And becoming at least experienced and like an intermediate level in like knowing how HTTP works is pretty much a must-have if you want to do decoupled implementations, because HTTP is the way in which all of those APIs operate. Another caveat is I would recommend that don't think about doing a decoupled implementation unless you're building a specific custom site or app. If you're a plugin developer and you're looking to build something for the masses, you can definitely get into this, but it's very much early days in terms of figuring out what the common use cases are that everyone could use that actually leverage a decoupled approach. I would really only recommend it for projects that are specific to a client or a project or an implementation and have like the time and the developers available to really give the implementation its due. This isn't something you'll be able to click together with a few mouse clicks and filling in some fields. It's going to require digging in, writing code, learning HTTP, inspecting packets, and all that goodness. And so don't go down that road unless you are committed to like fulfilling the obligation. On the upside, I really believe that this will grow the WordPress market. We've seen the broad growth as a segment of the internet, which is driven to a large extent by blogs. But we've also seen, we had this survey that we ran and released the results of last week. We've also seen that WordPress is clearly moving up market. It's moving into more advanced use cases for more sophisticated clients, bigger sites, higher traffic, higher visibility, higher importance. And the development of these APIs and these approaches will help drive that, help drive the kind of top-end WordPress so that we can do more interesting implementations, and the developers in the community are building more and more of these kind of in-demand skills, knowing how to do these kinds of builds. So it's a very exciting time, I think, for WordPress as a project. So let's get into how you actually go about decoupling, because there's lots of ways to do it, and lots of example implementations. We'll get to some specific examples at the end. So by far the most common way that people do decoupled development now is with a static generator or static renderer. And this is where you use your CMS, you use WordPress as the canonical base of the content, the editorial interface, the administrative interface. That's like the real, the huge benefit of being able to do this with WordPress or another CMS, is that you get all the administrative functionality for free out of the box, and you don't have to go about building some kind of custom backend. So you're using the CMS really just to manage content, and then you have either some generator like a Sculpin or a Jekyll or something else that you trigger when you want to do a deploy, and it like spiders through the API and renders out all the files. Or you might have something that does that dynamically. Like there's a couple of different people that have example node apps that will dynamically, they'll sort of cache things on their end, and so you don't have to actually do a build and a push. It just kind of will fetch the new content whenever it's needed. And at the end of the road, what it's rendering out to a user is really just static HTML. And the beauty of that is that you can turn your front end developers loose. They can make the leanest, meanest, most elegant implementation of the HTML and CMS. They can really optimize the front end performance. Static HTML scales really well. Like you're probably never going to have, you can do millions and millions of page views, and it's very straightforward how to handle that. And it's pretty secure because there's nothing to hack. You're just delivering static files. So the downside is there's no dynamic capabilities. So the upside is you can scale it really easily, and it's highly secure. So that's a pretty common use case, and I can say with confidence that there are a lot of folks that are doing this kind of stuff right now. Another approach, which is actually kind of the approach that the WordPress administrative UI takes, is a hybrid one, where some pages are delivered by the CMS completely, and some pages contain elements which then are dynamically populated thereafter. So when you have these kinds of interactive user interfaces in the admin area for managing media and other stuff like that, those are kind of using this hybrid approach where the things that are interactive and driven via AJAX are now using APIs, and that on the front end they're using Backbone or another JavaScript framework to manage that. And what this does is it allows you to sort of power dynamic forms and dashboards, and it restrains the scope of what you're doing. You're not trying to replace the whole website, you're just trying to enhance a specific experience. So there's the single page app, and this is one in which rather than doing a static rendering on the front end, you actually have a fully dynamic application. So this is how we built our dashboard at Pantheon. So there's a single page app that loads when you load your site dashboard, and everything else is just firing off of our API with JavaScript talking to our API. And this is for when you want to build something that actually feels like an application. You deliver via the browser, and it's not something where the user is in a I'm clicking links and loading pages kind of mode. They are in a I'm using my web browser like it was an application window. Lots of exciting capabilities here, lots of interesting stuff for data visualization, for collaboration, real-time applications, push notifications, all that kind of stuff gets very, very cool in this space. And a similar one to that would be where it's not a browser, it's actually a native mobile application on the front end. So there are definitely people that are doing this now where they are shipping something through an app store, the Apple App Store or Google Play, or maybe even the Microsoft App Store, I don't even know. But they're shipping an app down to people's phones. The phone is connecting to a decoupled implementation, a CMS on the back end, and everything from this, the CMS actually powers core app functionality, like maybe they're like sharing data, or it's keeping track of stuff, to simpler instances where actually know somebody who did this. They've made a game, like a simple little fantasy puzzle game in the is their app, but they wanted to be able to update the story content, just like the content that is part of the game, without forcing users to do an app update. So they have it phoning home to a CMS so that they can kind of adjust the story and do some tweaking of the app's behavior without having users have to go to the App Store and accept an upgrade. So that's kind of cool. And then in many cases, when you do this, your native mobile app also has a website that it's associated with, because at a minimum you're promoting it, but maybe the users can also log into that website and access some of the same data that's available through the native mobile app, or participate in whatever the functionality of that is. So this also is kind of the way that will drive Internet of Things approach. So replace native mobile phone app with the app in your refrigerator or your car or whatever else it is, and that's the same kind of approach that you would take here. And finally, I want to point out the CMS on CMS or zombie WordPress approach. Sometimes in the early days we would call the decoupled approach headless. And so this is kind of like Frankenstein-ish. You've taken the head of one website and put it on the body of another. It's a zombie CMS. And so the interesting thing about this is it's essentially saying, I want to get the architectural benefits of this separation of concerns, but I actually don't want to have to develop separate technical expertises within my team. Maybe what I have on my team is just a bunch of CMS developers. And so what we want to do there is have one team that's focused on layout and display, and another team that's focused on editorial, workflow, and data. And so this allows you to do things where the team that's focused on the back end can really just be laser focused on performance and making sure that if you have a site that's got tens of millions of posts, right? You've got to be really focused on the performance of all of your queries and so forth to make sure that site is always humming. And that's something that can be a challenge to do if you're also trying to meet changing demands for layouts and new sidebar content and so forth. So you have one back-end team that's just focused on making sure the content base is like a well-oiled machine, and then you have a front-end team that's actually just talking to that over an API. And so the performance of the APIs can be controlled, and then they can be really liberated to do whatever they can come up with creatively, given the restrictions of those APIs, to display things better and run different tests. Do users respond better to this layout or that layout, or do we need to do something different with our ad formats or so forth? Kind of cuts those teams loose. And we actually have a couple of customers on the platform that are doing stuff like this and seeing success, even though it's a little wonky to imagine. WordPress has internally everything it needs to consume APIs as well as produce them, so it can actually play both roles if you would like it to. Sort of in summary, this is not new stuff. I mean, it is new stuff, right? All the specific implementations and techniques and the front-end tool chain and all this stuff, there's a lot of new shiny, but at a fundamental level, this is client-server architecture. This is service-oriented architecture. This is stuff that, every time I talk about this at a conference, there's always some, cagey veteran of the earlier days of the internet that will be like, I was doing that with a front-end that was using Shockwave back in 2005. And yeah, that's what people were doing. They were building these kind of like, embedded applications with things like Shockwave, and they were talking to backends somehow. The difference is now that we have we have much better frameworks and tools to support that type of development. So like the modern front-end HTML5 JavaScript stack is vastly superior to Shockwave Flash in almost every way, unless you're like deep into Adobe's digital rights management stuff, in which case I pity the fool. And our ability to deliver APIs, the sort of standardization of REST, JSON, those conventions, just means that we have to invent far fewer wheels to get this stuff rolling, to get one of these projects off the ground. So probably some of you on the call have experience with this from other projects earlier in your careers, from other walks of life, and it isn't new on some level, but on another level it is, and it's pretty exciting. So what's new news is definitely WordPress 4.4. This is the first release of WordPress core that contains REST API framework elements. You still need to install some plugins to get the endpoints in place and everything, so it's not just like everything is ready to go out of the box. But at a technical architecture level, there was a really, really big step forward, which was the team that had been developing the REST API as a feature plugin got a substantive amount of their code into WordPress core. So the WordPress has this wonderful way of developing, which is you can kind of start a project and say, I want it to be a feature plugin, which explicitly means I'm kind of campaigning for this to go into core. And they've been developing, Ryan and Rachel and Scott and Daniel have been developing the REST API as a feature plugin for years now. Actually, I think it started something like 4 years ago. Version 2.0 came out earlier this year. That's the version that they want to get into core, and a big piece of it got committed. So you still need to install some plugins to get this stuff working, as I'll show you in our demo. But it's like, it's real. This is happening. This is going to be completely contained within WordPress core within the next few releases, and it's an excellent time to start thinking about API compatibility if you're a plugin developer, and it's an excellent time if you're someone who implements custom sites for clients or to build applications to start taking this stuff really seriously, because it's no longer up for debate. This is where we're going, and get excited. Another big release was Calypso, which is from Automatic, and it's a React.js based application for administering the WordPress.com sites, and there's ways to make it, I think, work with self-hosted sites as well. And they open source the whole thing, which is really wonderful, and it's a great inspirational example. It doesn't use the WordPress REST API stuff because they started on this more than a year ago, so they couldn't depend on that. It uses some of the Jetpack APIs. But I think one of the things that's going to be interesting that shakes out over the next 6 months to a year is, how will Jetpack's API structure embrace more of the WordPress, the stuff that's going to be in core, and what will core need to add in order to cover all the use cases that Jetpack already covers. But it's sort of like, if you want to look at it from an example standpoint of 6 of one, half dozen of the other. They're both solid APIs to use, and it's extensive what they did. They built a whole new front end, and they actually can deliver it as an app that you run on your desktop, on Mac, on Windows. It's very, very cool. And again, the whole thing is open source. So massive kudos to them for putting this out there and showing the world what's possible. I think this is not the like mic drop, it's all done, but this is I think a huge first step. And we'll look back at this in a few years and say, all the things that were built on top of this this initial idea are going to be, considered must-haves in the world of WordPress. And I have a little demonstration that I'm going to do live for you all, and hopefully the deities of demonstration are pleased with me. Let me jump out of this and open up Chrome. So this is a project that I started at the Contributor Day. I actually started this project when I did a talk on decoupled WordPress at WordCamp LA this fall. But I was able to sink the bulk of the afternoon at Contributor Day from WordCamp Philly into this. And there's a website called To Do MVC, which I'll just load up real quick for you. And this is something that the sort of Cambrian explosion of JavaScript framework people put together. I think it really came together like 4, maybe 5 years ago, and it's just been growing ever since. And basically what it is it's like a zillion examples of the same basic to-do list application this, that, the other, and check, check, delete, delete. So like this simple to-do list application, which is kind of cool, right? But it's fairly simple. It's also something as a developer, if you're new to this, you can totally get your head around everything that's going on here. It's not like an entire WordPress management implementation like Calypso. It's just a to-do list. So it provides a pretty good example. And the beauty of this is that they built it and they got implementations from like all the frameworks. So there's like these, there's these, there's these. It's just like there's a lot there. And so it developed a lot of expertise in the and it helped drive a lot of learning for developers who are getting their heads around this style of JavaScript development. And so what I'm looking to do is to create something similar where we build the same type of to-do list functionality, but we actually use WordPress as the backend. And at the state that the repo's in now, it's got end-to-end setup instructions, but there's a lot to do. It's just using a pretty kludgy React example that I was able to put together in an hour or two. So we really need, and on the back end, it's not doing anything clever with WordPress. So there's a vision for this, and I would really love it if other developers would come in and could lend some effort to it. But we'll get there, over the next few months, because I think this will actually help quite a lot. And so you don't need to just trust the screenshots. I can actually show it to you. So these are running here on my local environment. Here's the to-do application powered by React. Here's the WordPress site that is backing it. And so if I wanted to add a new, like, live demo, please, I can add that to-do. And if I go over here and reload my admin, oh no, demo gods are not pleased. It looks like I may have a little bit of brokenness in my implementation. Let's see if I can check something off. Nope. So I am at the mercy of the demo gods. But the end-to-end implementation does essentially work, and what it does is it shows you how to have a WordPress site that uses post to mirror the back-end for all the to-dos and the JavaScript, and you can check them off and it'll say done. You can delete them and you can create new ones. I'll have to look later on at what exactly went wrong in this and probably improve my README a little bit. But this is the idea of something that can help a little bit as we sort of look to meet the challenge of learning WordPress deeply and enjoying delicious barbecue. The irony. Putting that in the slide was just begging for trouble. So there are a lot of other resources that are out there. So there's sort of my to-do WP. There's the Calypso application. There was another presentation that Mark from Blue Cadet and my colleague Matt Cheney gave at WordCamp Philly about some other implementations that they've done that has some pretty cool stuff where they're actually doing this in the real world where they build installations for museums, like giant touchscreen things that cover entire walls that are powered through basically an embedded C++ application that talks to WordPress on the back end to get the content to show people at the museum. They have some examples there. And just today, Zach Gordon, who's one of the most prolific trainers in the WordPress community, announced an initiative to do I think it's a 40-session masterclass in JavaScript for WordPress developers. So javascriptforwp.com. I would check that out if you're interested in getting hooked up with something to learn more. And that's something like invest 40, a couple hours a week for 40 weeks, and you will become a master of these things. I totally believe in Zach as a trainer, and I'm super excited that he's sort of taken that on. So there's a lot more resources out there, and I think with that, I'm happy to take questions from the audience.
Alrighty, Josh. So we're going to launch into the Q&A portion of today's presentation. Make sure you submit any questions you have, so we can squeeze them into the 20 minutes we have left. So the first question is, or more of a statement, can you comment on the dangers of using a one-size-fits-all CMS, such as WordPress, for doing what in all likelihood are custom applications?
So there are risks and benefits of using WordPress as an application framework as opposed to just as a CMS. So an example might be I'm going to use WordPress and I'm going to develop some accounting software. Like I know how a certain type of small business needs to run its books, and I know how to implement the perfect interface for that in WordPress, and I know I can make WordPress as a database do everything I need to do to back it up, and I can just build that out. And so this isn't something where you actually have much of a website because it's like all internal. It's probably tracking lots and lots of rows of data, and accounting tracking is very different than publishing. So the risks are that you end up pounding a lot to get a square peg to fit into a round hole. And there are potentially risks if you don't think about the implications of how that will scale. Right? Is this one instance per customer, or do you want to have like thousands of customers logging into the same WordPress instance? Those are things you need to consider. Those things if you're building a custom application too. It's just often that I think when people build off of a CMS as a framework, you can get really excited by how fast you get something up and running that you then don't think about how it's going to scale out if it's successful. The upsides are that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? You don't have to invent a user system. You don't have to invent the core CRUD for your API. You don't have to invent a layer for display and so forth, right? Even if you don't end up decoupling any of that, you just use it as the app. The monolithic implementation could be the app, right? You don't have to reinvent all of these things, and you can take the conventions that are there. I look at what people end up doing when they build custom apps with lower level frameworks, like they use Symfony, or they use Node, or they use Ruby, and get ready to write the I forgot my password routine, because that's pretty fundamental and core, and nobody's going to do that for you. And get ready to do now there's, for developers, that can be attractive actually, because there's maybe some like novel way that you want to do some of this stuff that is part of your application, which is cool. But a lot of times, no. I mean, the forgotten password, the way that WordPress handles when users forget passwords is actually good, and maybe we just take that and run with it rather than building it from scratch. So to me, I think the challenges are understanding that you're going to end up doing a lot of custom code, and you're going to own a lot of the application. That would be true if you did it from scratch anyway. But with WordPress, you're not going to build a great WordPress app by clicking together some plugins, right? You're going to write a bunch of custom code, and you're going to own it. And there's probably some extent to which you may start to pound a square peg in a round hole. But on the upside, you get a lot of stuff for free. You can get started quickly. If you have a long-term vision, you might actually even think of it as a version 1, right? And if you're wildly successful, maybe you rebuild version 2 and you use some other tools to do it. But you can get version 1 up and running and in the market quickly. That gives you validation that your idea has merit, before you sink a bunch more time and effort into a custom implementation.
Alrighty, our next question is, would love to hear thoughts on pre-rendering services and how Pantheon would like us to use them, like prerender.io, so that when we have pure JS websites, they can still be properly indexed and cached.
So you should not worry about the indexing question. It's FUD. You do not need to pre-render your JavaScript front-end components for search engines. As for the challenge of delivering something so that you get the first page load is really fast, that's a good one. I think that there are a bunch of different techniques for doing this, and I don't know. I don't know whether pre-rendering is actually even the best one. What I've seen people doing within the frameworks, having the frameworks have an awareness of what their initial state should be. So the simplest way to build something is page load 1 downloads the HTML, that then downloads the JavaScript. The JavaScript then requests all of the initial data. Another way to do that, and React is particularly good at this, I know, because it's baked into their notion of how things work, is that there's actually, a bunch of default data is provided along with that initial HTML, so that the end user experience is not one of waiting super long for things to load. And that pre-rendering kind of gets you into can get you into weird situations if you're trying to do that. You can totally do it, but I'm not a strong believer in it.
Alrighty, next question is React.js versus Vue.js. Do you have some insight on both of these frameworks?
So I don't know a lot about Vue.js. So all I can say is React.js has been given a gold star by Automatic and is backed by Facebook. So I have a high amount of confidence that it will be around in 10 years and will receive continued investment, and that's a good reason to take it seriously. I don't know whether Vue.js has similar institutional backing, and it's not like institutional backing means that it's the right choice. It just means that it's probably not the wrong choice. But the JavaScript framework debate is a hot one, and I think that maybe you don't need to think in a 10-year time frame. Maybe you want to use another framework that you really like because you want to do something right now. That's a perfectly valid choice. Like, they're all JavaScript. It's not like one of them is going to suddenly be broken. It's just a question of, and it's also the case that many of them utilize very similar idioms, and in getting the mental model of any one of them will help you learn all of the others. So I don't want people to stress out too much about making the right or wrong choice here. I'm just saying that, like, if you look at that to-do MVC page, the number of choices that exist can be bewildering, and if you want to just pick one, I would say pick Angular, React, or Backbone as the first one to try.
Righty. Our next question is, what would be an example of the CMS on CMS architecture? WordPress on top and Confluence underneath? Question mark.
Sure. It could be WordPress on WordPress, WordPress on Drupal, Drupal on WordPress, Confluence on Confluence. Actually, I don't know if you could do that, but sure. Like, you could have Confluence is a wiki software from Atlassian. You might be running a Confluence wiki internally, and you want to expose some amount of your Confluence data as part of your website. You could have the WordPress site be a client of Confluence, and maybe it loads those pieces from the wiki, and that's where they're canonically managed. And maybe there's a blog also in there that is managed directly in WordPress. Actually, we're kind of doing an approach like that for a website that I'm working on right now, which is going to have a bunch of information on tips for scalability, kind of based on the lightning talk and some other stuff that I've done at recent conferences. And so we're using WordPress for it, and the sort of main content pages are actually going to live in GitHub. But then other ancillary content pages and like a blog where you can quickly post updates will be managed directly in WordPress. So it's kind of that hybrid approach where the true backend for some of the content will actually be a Git repository, which is kind of cool.
Righty, our next question is, does Pantheon plan on providing the infrastructure to define and host front-end and back-end services as opposed to hosting them on AWS or another cloud platform?
So it depends on what front-end and back-end services mean, but we have a lot of people doing this stuff right now. Our runtime is only supports PHP, so if you want to run a Node app, you can't do it on Pantheon. But we have, I actually don't believe that Pantheon should be the, Pantheon itself doesn't want to be a monolith, right? We're not trying to be the everything of all of your development tools. We're trying to take care of like a really important set of tools and do a really amazing job with those things. But I fully expect, in fact, I know that we have people that are doing kind of next generation implementations of some things, and they're using Pantheon for the CMS infrastructure, and they have a Heroku instance which is running some Node stuff on the side. That's awesome. We totally are in favor of that type of development. But we also have people where, like, on our own front. So we use a Sculpin-generated static site for all of our documentation, and that's just hosted on Pantheon. It works just fine. We also have, like, if you just want to deploy your JavaScript application and have that be served off of Pantheon and talk to CMS that's back-ended on Pantheon, that's also just fine. So those sorts of things are fully supported.
Next question is, how does WordPress compare to Drupal 8 in implementing this approach?
So both WordPress, now with the REST API going into core, and Drupal 8, which includes a REST module in core, will provide more or less out-of-the-box APIs. The one thing that I think that and I think that they're roughly equivalent. And what they both do is they both expose the internal data model of the CMS over a REST API to a consumer, which is all that you could really expect a CMS to do out of the box. However, I will say that there is work to be done probably not in the core of either system, but in the plugin space to help developers implement more elegant APIs. Because one of the things that a front-end developer, front-end developers do not want to deal with the idiosyncratic internals of your CMS, right? What they want is a very, they want everything lean and mean. They don't want all the extra divs in the template. They don't want to have to load a bunch of extra CSS that isn't needed for this page. And when they talk to an API, they only want it to give them the data that they care about. They don't want to see a bunch of other stuff, and they don't want to see weird internal names. Post meta might not make any sense to them. So I believe that there is work still to be done as these types of implementations gain traction. On the Drupal side of things, there's the RESTful module, which does this, and essentially it gives you a framework for exposing a leaner API. And on the WordPress side, the capability is there in the REST API plugin, but I don't know of, that'd be one of the things I'd like to develop for my to-do list implementation, is actually show how you can create an endpoint for that is much more friendly to a front-end developer, because it doesn't just kind of barf out everything that WordPress knows. It gives only the information that's necessary for the application. That's still work to be done, and pretty exciting work. If you're a back-end developer and you're kind of like, what's my role in all this? I don't know that I want to learn the JavaScript frameworks and so forth. Dude, I'm with you. Like I'm a JavaScript noob, really, when it comes down to it. But there's a bunch of work to be done from the back end to really support these use cases as well. And exposing leaner and more elegant APIs is a big part of that. Both Drupal and WordPress need help.
Great. Next question. Can you point to a case study for the museum app that you mentioned that talked to WordPress?
I will have to dig up whether or not Blue Cadet has anything published on that. They definitely talked about it in their session, but they really only, in the session it was like, oh, here's a screenshot and a thing, and then later on I got like a more full demo explanation from Mark, and I think he kind of undersold it in the session. So I'll find out if they have they've published a case study or not. But it's certainly one of the cooler applications that I've seen, and we'll share it if I can. If such a case study exists, we'll share it.
Okay. Next question. You mentioned that there are iOS apps out there using headless architecture. Anything specific come to mind?
So I don't recall the name of the fantasy puzzle game off the top of my head. It wasn't like a bestseller in the App Store, full disclosure. But I do know that this is something that is being done right now. So again, one of the challenges of doing stuff this way is people want to be a little bit cagey about scale. But no, actually, let me take that back. I do know that the apps, some of the news apps, are actually using this type of infrastructure. So I think it was, I think Time Magazine or one of the other big ones that recently moved to WordPress. This was one of the reasons they wanted to take advantage of the API to be able to drive updates down to their people who install the app into the phone, as well as driving a better mobile experience through the web. So those are real things. That's actually happening right now, and it's not like science fiction. It's fact.
Okay. What are your thoughts on using a plugin like Apresser as an alternative to using the WP REST API plugin?
So I can't say that I'm familiar with that plugin in particular. And so I don't want to say that you should or shouldn't use it, but I will say that becoming conversant in the stuff that's going to be in core is to your benefit. So the REST API plugin is what's moving into core, so learning its ins and outs will translate across all projects. There will certainly be other plugins that will augment its functionality, and maybe this is something that the Apresser plugin does, but I think that the idioms and sort of the hooks and actions and schemas that the REST API uses are the ones that everyone, they are ones that every developer that wants to do this should learn.
Okay. Are there any WordPress theme frameworks that are better positioned to take advantage of a decoupled architecture that uses a JS front-end framework?
So the REST API team has a theme that that is kind of a reference implementation that they're developing that goes along with it. I think it's called Picard, and it uses Backbone. And I know that one of the guys that I met, Roy, in LA, had developed something similar with Angular, where it basically was a theme framework for Angular. But I don't believe yet that any of the major kind of the big time theme frameworks are doing stuff in this, like doing a lot in this way, and certainly like things like underscores. It's just about getting kind of like a lean starting place to go from. That doesn't yet have anything built into it that would be JavaScript aware or decoupled enabled. But I would imagine that such things will emerge over the next year as the reference implementation that comes with the plugin evolves, and maybe more things like this example theme get out there and get more eyes on them. The challenge is a lot of what's being done right now is kind of like it's one or two developers that are working on a proof of concept, and until we see more developers participating in improving these tools and more implementations going into the real world, providing kind of use case feedback for stuff, it'll still remain kind of proof of concept-y rather than truly like use this framework. And that's why I say, like, for where you are right now, you should really be thinking about using this on a particular site, a custom implementation that has the timeline, that has the team and the budget to support the amount of work that will need to be done to implement this stuff, because there's no viable quick starts that I'm aware of.
Right, we have time to sneak in just a few more questions. Next one is, in your opinion, is it safe to start using hybrid, partially decoupled mobile interfaces in production?
Yes, absolutely. WordPress admin does it now.
Awesome. Next question. Seems like decoupling could shrink the role of themers. What skills should a themer add to her capabilities to preserve her value?
So I actually kind of disagree. Well, maybe I agree and I disagree. So I think that the title of themer is kind of this weird in-betweener kind of role. And I think that themers should aspire to, like, stand up straight and like put on their jackets and call themselves full-fledged front-end developers, because that's what they are. They're implementing the actual, stuff that manipulates a browser to display the right images and text to the user. That's front-end development. That's real development. It's not like second-class citizen, not true software development. It's the real deal. And the amount of innovation and exciting stuff that's happening on the front end is really staggering. So I think that I think that if you, for themers should be thinking about learning JavaScript. Themers should be thinking about learning the mental models and the paradigms of these frameworks and how they deal with templates and how they deal with binding data and so forth, and understanding that what they're increasingly going to be tasked with delivering are not static, like I clicked this link and I loaded this page, but actually pages that have a level of dynamism to them that may be getting updated through push notifications or maybe getting updated dynamically in response to user actions. But that's all really exciting stuff that I think actually increases the scope of the role of a themer. And I think that themers becoming front-end developers is going to be a trend of the next decade.
Lots of the decoupled tools you mentioned are front-end frameworks, such as Angular, React, etc. Our team is finding good efficiencies using a server-side framework like Symfony, PHP, and Pattern Lab templates to decouple. Can you comment on server-side decoupling and any pros, cons, or emerging practices?
So yeah, this was when at the very beginning when I started to go through the many ways of decoupling. Kind of server-side static decoupling is by far and away the most prevalent use now. It's the most well-tested. We did a conversation this summer with Pixo, and they have a whole tool chain built around Pattern Lab that's really awesome. Pattern Lab is essentially a front-end developer suite that helps you follow the practice of atomic design. And they, I don't know if it ever got released. They had a thing, I think it was called Outpost. And it was essentially a simple Symfony app to bridge Pattern Lab-based design work and a WordPress CMS backend. That it helps fulfill that kind of parallel track progress notion of your front-end developers are getting deep into this notion of atomic design and building reusable elements and thinking through all those things and how it works on different devices and so forth. And they're not forced to contend with any of the idiosyncrasies or preferences that WordPress as a CMS might push upon them. They can just do their thing. And then the WordPress backend is just managing all the content, and you have this kind of Symfony shim in between that is just managing how the WordPress content and the Pattern Lab templates get put together to actually render a real website. So those are great practices, and again, I think that kind of static munging of front end and back end is the most common and the most well-worn path of decoupled implementation today.
All right, we're going to squeeze in 2 more questions. Next one is, why would you want to use WordPress plus WordPress?
Again, the advantage there is that it's a decoupling of concerns, but not a decoupling of technologies. So the use case is you have a lot of WordPress expertise on your team, and you want to leverage that WordPress expertise with some of these advantages. So you build one WordPress front-end application that manages display and layout, and another one that manages content and editorial. And those can be 2 separate things. You can parallel track the progress. You can iterate on either independent of the other. It's a bit bizarre. Like, I don't think this is super common. I've just seen people doing it and doing it successfully. And I think it's expand your mind. All these things are possible.
Is there some organization leading the way in standards API for publishing tools with REST, WordPress, Drupal, etc.?
Not really. There are standards around REST API formats like JSON and HAL. That's a particular format where the body of the core data is JSON, which everyone prefers these days, and then there's this additional context block called HAL, which is like, if you'd like to know more about this, that, or the other, here are the links to the API calls to learn more about this, that, or the other. And that's nice because it creates a common format for front ends to actually learn how to explore an API theoretically independently or provide navigation through an API. But in terms of more specific formats for publishing, like this is what you call a title, and this is what you call a body, and this is what you call a slug, I'm not aware of anything that's standardizing that as of yet. I don't know. Will be interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see what happens when this stuff really rolls out and it's all in WordPress core over the next few releases, because what that will mean is every up-to-date WordPress site will have this API, and even though it is kind of just like exposing all of WordPress's internals, that will, over that course of that release, become one of the most widely available APIs ever and become something of a de facto spec. So it'll be interesting to see how much of that gets adopted versus how much people decide that they want to pare down for better front-end implementations. The other thing about Decoupled that's important to remember is that it's not just about reading, it's also about writing. We didn't talk about it too much here, but it is also about the ability to get data into WordPress from many other sources. So, like in my to-do list example that unfortunately hit a snag, like making a to-do with React creates a post in WordPress. So pushing data in is just as a big part of the picture more broadly as getting data out.
Right, that's all we have time for today. Thank you all so much for joining us. If you have any questions or feedback, please visit our website where you'll find a Contact Us page, and we'll put you in touch with the best member of our team. Have a great week and happy holidays, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.